Hello and welcome everyone to our February EdTech Chats. I'm Amy Tessitore, the Global Manager of Adoption and Education, and I am so excited to have Chris here with us today as our co-host for this month's EdTech Chats. I'm going to give Chris an opportunity to introduce himself so that you can know who he is, and then we're going to jump into our topic for this month. Chris, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Of course. Thank you, Amy. I'm really happy to be here. But many of you may have known of me already. I have two jobs actually. One is being part of the community initiatives team at OpenLMS. So we try to do all kinds of things and activities to keep our community engaged and nurtured. So that's like for our clients. And then for the public at large, I am part of the eLearn magazine team. So we always try to write content with news, information, guides about technology. We are tech agnostic in there, so I recommend you check it out. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here. And before you get started, I just wanted to give a shout out to Michael. But he has moved on to other opportunities, but I think because of him, I'm here and this space is possible. So just wanted to say hi. And hi to everyone who's already joining us and leaving us comments here. And I will be mentioning, and please leave us your questions, your comments throughout the session.
Awesome. Thank you. Yes. As Chris mentioned, Michael has moved on to another role. We'll probably see him here from time to time. He might even hop on the EdTech chat today as a viewer. But we are excited to be here today to talk about a topic that's pretty important to us, but probably to all of you as well, which is the topic of digital literacy. And part of why we are talking about that this month, in the month of February, is because tomorrow, February 15th, is Digital Education Day, so World Digital Education Day. And since that's what most of us are into here, we're offering either education in higher ed or K 12, or perhaps we're doing technical training or learning and development, professional development. Either way, we're trying to reach a broad audience with whatever we do. And digital literacy is a big part of the success that people can have while taking these courses online or engaging with any type of online content. And it's not just on the education side, digital literacy is important in all aspects of our life. And I think as we get into things today, you will find out that that is the case here. So, Chris, I know you and I have been talking quite a bit about digital literacy over the past couple of weeks, just
Yeah.
kind of exploring some of our thoughts on that and some of the, what it is and why it's important in today's world. And so, I know that one of the things we talked about is that digital literacy is really a technical skill. So it's really that ability to access technology, leverage technology. And it's really important because we live in a very technology oriented world. So even down to things like our banking, a lot of our banking is online now through apps, or how we're communicating with friends and family is happening through technology. And so is our capture of information, whether that's through taking courses online or the news or things that we read online. And so being able to have those skills to access that information is super important. So it really kind of boils down to like tech fluency. And I think that when we think about digital literacy and how it's kind of changed over time, um, really way back in the day when computers were kind of brand new, the digital literacy was like you could log on to your Apple IIe and maybe you could type a paper. And then maybe it expanded out from there where, you were using other types of technology. I can remember when cordless phones became very popular during like the late 80s, early 90s, and you could pre-program people's phone numbers in. And that was a huge thing. And then we started to see like video gaming come on the scene. But then as access to devices and access to the internet became more widespread, I think that what we viewed as digital literacy changed over time. We went from the very basic pieces to carrying around, most of us, smartphones, a very sophisticated piece of technology with us everywhere. and needing to know how to use that. Or even looking at our cars. My first car had windows that you rolled up and down with a crank, and now your car can do everything for you. I don't even use all the technology in my car, and my car is a little bit older. Newer cars have lots of things. So that
Right.
digital literacy skill is super important in every part of our life. And I know
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead, Chris.
No, I think you mentioned um, like the historical context. I think is really, really important, because as we were researching the topic, we realized that probably tech fluency is kind of the first concept associated to the ability to learn and make the most of the technology that's out there. And as technology itself evolves, it's important that we keep asking ourselves how the way we understand and teach about this technology evolves as well. I think one key difference with today's world, that it's more connected than before, is that now it's not just enough for us to know how to use something, but to properly navigate the world and the different content that you find, the way you connect with people through that. And those are things that have been kind of adding on top of the digital literacy scape, or the skill sets, if you will.
Mhm. You just mentioned the word digital literacy, and the part of that I kind of grabbed onto is the literacy piece. And having been a teacher and a professor before, there are almost always 4 C's associated with anything that involves literacy. Are there 4 C's of digital literacy? Look at that.
There sure is. There used to be, like for literacy regularly, there were 4 C's. We wanted to play this little game with the audience if you want to join in. So one of the questions that we have for you is like, what are the 4 C's for literacy, if you know? But then, and considering how this is something that it's always evolving, and it also really depends on the kind of job that you do, maybe you should have the freedom to pick your own C's, right? So yeah, I mean, I'm curious to know, what would be your 4 C's if you had to pick them out of
Yes.
this.
On the spot. My 4 C's, I think, for specifically for digital literacy, is going to be the connecting piece, both with the technology, but with the community. I think that's super important. Context, so understanding how what you're doing relates to what you are hoping to get back. So, what is the context? Am I looking for information? Am I looking for a social connection? The Curiosity is a big one for me. I think curiosity really drives people to seek out more information. So I find that to be a 4C when it comes to digital literacy. And then the critical thinking piece. And I think it's the critical thinking that helps us to not just have digital literacy, but information literacy too. And the two really do overlap now. So that critical thinking can help you decipher between what is true and what might not be true, as you access internet through the information through the internet and things. How about for you, Chris? What are your 4 C's?
Well, I've been thinking about it, and there's some of them that I think, like for example, critical thinking is, to me, with something that kind of transcends the digital literacy part, but it's really important that you take it into account. And as we will see later, you need to be very critical in the way you use the technology, the way you use it to communicate, to connect, and so on. So even though it's kind of broader, I would pick it. I would also pick creativity, kind of split between creativity and curiosity. I think the one difference is that creativity, it's kind of imagination, but put it into action, put it at work to some extent. So those two, and then there's a lot of them that it's really hard to choose, and I guess that's kind of the point why we have this word cloud here. I like context. I think context is is really important in most cases. I've come to realize. It's always important to know in which setting is a skill being used, a technology is being utilized, and to what end. So I would say context, very important. And the final one, I'm going to steal that connection or community from you, because I think, again, as we will see and as we discussed, now it's really important that we know that kind of the point of the literacy or learning in general always has to involve others, right? It always has to do with how we kind of help each other, uplift each other, educate each other, of course, learn from each other. So yeah, that would be my 4 Cs.
I like that. And I think that that community piece is so important. And you, like you said, you really have to connect with others to learn. And you have to connect with the content and feel like what you're learning is useful in some way. And I think community is such a big part of that. Um, so we've kind of talked about what digital literacy is and what our 4 Cs are. Um, and so that kind of gives us a bit of that understanding of digital literacy. I think one of the things that I think about often and I encounter often are some misconceptions or misinformation about digital literacy. I remember when I was working in higher ed, I had some students, randomly I would have students who had trouble with the technology or had difficulty trying to use technology. And there was a bit of a misconception or a misunderstanding with one, their age and the assumption that because they are digital natives, they know how to use the technology. But I think one of the things that came up is that the people not understanding how digital literacy intersects with critical thinking skills, both for the person who's trying to develop digital literacy skills and for the world around them who sort of expects certain things from them. When you think about that, and you mentioned critical thinking in yours, I mentioned mine, and as we think about these misconceptions overall, what are your thoughts on how digital literacy intersects with critical thinking? Do you think that there's an intersection and there's a relationship? There must be because we both brought it up in our 4 Cs, but what do you think about when you think about that?
Well, it yeah, and I think something that it's always important to mention, and I've seen it like throughout my career, is that before you start making use of a tool or any piece of technology, really, you need to have a couple of things defined, figured out by yourself before you get into it. And the first is like, what do you want to get out of it? How do you want to, I don't know, design something or build something? If we want to talk about our LMS, for example, you have to have an idea of what is the final outcome. I was just remembering a session that we had, I think, almost 2 years ago, where we were just trying to create a course for the World Cup with LADEC. And you joined us for one session. And you were telling us how you sometimes really enjoy to build a course like from the end and backwards, kind of.
Yep.
That way you are kind of sure of what you really want the outcome to be. And you don't want the technology to be the one who decides that for you, which is something that I see too often, especially now with AI, which is kind of seen as a tool meant to kind of finish your thoughts, which I think is wrong and problematic, but anyway. And in general, just having this idea of what you want to get out of it and how to make the most of the tools that you've been using, I think it's just essential for you to actually have a constructive relationship with any piece of technology.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a couple of things in there too. Oh, I think I lost sound for a minute.
No, hear you loud and
Nope.
clear.
Okay, I couldn't hear you. anyway, what I was going to say is, I think you hit on a couple things. The misconceptions are really, really interesting, but it all does play into the critical thinking, not just for the person learning the skills, but also when we're creating these bits of content or these items for people to interact with. Um, it takes a lot of critical thinking on the front end to think to set those goals, to set the why. How are we going to measure this? How are we going to help people get there? Um, and under misconceptions, that first one, digital natives are younger and people are inherently digitally literate. There's this assumption that kids just automatically know how to use technology. And there are some ways that that's true, right? So people who've grown up with technology are used to touch screens. They're used to information being at their fingertips. But that doesn't always mean they know how to leverage that technology to achieve the outcome they need to achieve. Um, so, for example, I have two children. Many of you know I have two teenagers. They are great with video games, good with their phones, all of these things. But one of them cannot type at all. He does everything. He has to use speech to text. He's just very slow at typing. Whereas the other prefers never to use speech to text. He can type very quickly. Um, but it's a good example of there was an expectation that because they are so used to technology, they should be great typists, but they've never been taught how to type. Anything that they know how to type has been things that they've picked up on their own. But a good example of a skill that's important when it comes to digital literacy that not all people have. There's also the narrative that people who are older are not digitally literate. And I would argue against that as well. My grandparents loved their iPads. They like to play games. They would communicate with everybody. They're iPhone users. The same with my parents. And so they're regularly using technology and have adapted to that, and have a fair amount of digital literacy. They know where to go to find information, what might be accurate and what isn't. So, the misconception that age is related to digital literacy is a really important one for us to remember. And also that digital literacy refers only to technical skills. While it is a skill and it is somewhat a technical skill in some ways, it's not entirely. You don't have to be really technologically inclined or really technical in the background to have good digital literacy skills, understanding what application to use for something or what piece of technology to use doesn't mean that you have to be super technical. And I think that this is a place where people often start to have some anxiety and concern, because they feel like I don't have tech skills, I don't know how to use the technology, and that can make people feel like they can't become digitally literate, but they can. And then that
Yeah.
digital literacy is static, right? So once and done, but and that the skills are defined forever. Did you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I remember you kind of talked too about your past life doing some training and some of the ways that we have to continue to nurture those digital skills over time.
Yeah, totally. I was going to say that I think one misconception or one way we kind of mixed up things regarding like the generations and how these ones are kind of more connected, and therefore kind of adults tend to expect that young children kind of pick every system up, and that's just not the case. But I think what's been happening is that interfaces have become more user-friendly, like in general. I think I would credit the iPhone and the iPad for a lot of it. Obviously, that's not like the work of one person, but it's really a slow process of evolution of technology, and now it just came together into this piece that everyone, and you see those videos that babies, animals are very, it's like very intuitive. I'm not sure how to say it like from a neurological perspective, but it kind of makes it easier for you to make the connections with your touch and what's happening on the screen and so on. And just because younger people were born surrounded by these more intuitive technologies, they kind of like right away get started with it. Whereas older generations, and I'm not a digital native, for example, and I do remember having to teach myself how to use a computer. It was like finishing what would be the equivalent of high school. And I think that's happening for for generations older than mine, uh, where they had this idea that it was complicated, that computers were clunky, they were hard to set up and use, and so on. And a lot of people kept that. But as more people started to, and you have your example with your mom, I have mine with my mom too. She does a lot with her iPad now, and at 60. She's never been kind of a computer savvy of any kind. But it's becoming this, the interfaces have become just more user friendly. But that comes with kind of a trade-off. And it was one of the first concerns among educators when the iPod and the iPad and these touch interfaces came out. And it was that because at the beginning, there had not been that many advances in typing or dictator voice and so on. Let alone there were no apps to create, to design, and now you can do anything on on an iPad, really. So I think what I take from that is that there were these concerns because making something intuitive kind of necessarily means that you need to take stuff out of it. And there's things that you cannot do. And with the first generations of the iPhones, you could not do much other than consume content, to put it that way. But now, as technology evolves, as they say in Silicon Valley, software has eaten the world. Every sector, every field uses software to any extent. So being a professional today means being able to manage a very specific, sometimes broader, like, I don't know, like Office Suite kind of works for a lot, but there's a lot of specific software. And I think that leads to that final point, like digital literacy is definitely not static. And I would dare to say it's not broad, like every different group of people or professionals or ages should probably have their unique kind of roadmap in terms of skills that they should be acquiring to make the most of the technology that they need to use on their day-to-day. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that idea of a roadmap is super important, because it can be very difficult to figure out where we need to take people, where they're starting, where we want to take them, but also to set them up for success for that lifelong learning piece of digital literacy. And I think you hit on it really well when when you gave the examples of when you taught yourself to use a computer to all of the power behind something like a tablet or an iPad today. Technology is always changing in the sense that more features are being brought in, more power is being brought in. But as long as you lay the foundation and you have some place to start from, I think it's easier to continue to build those skills, which I think is a very critical thing to understand about digital literacy. And it really does help to counteract that misconception that digital literacy is a one time thing. You develop it and you're done. But really, it's a skill like anything else that you work on all the time. And when we think about how we operate every day in our lives, there are skills we're building on all the time, and digital literacy is just the same. Um,
Yeah.
and I
Like, for
think,
example,
yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
um, like we were talking about different paths, and I associate that with personalized education.
Mhm.
I think now we have the luxury to enjoy technologies that could allow us to create personalized learning paths, even if we're just talking about digital literacy. So maybe one question that we could ask you or the audience is, how can we take advantage of technologies today to be able to generate these roadmaps that could be specific to a group or even just individualized learning? And then I comes back full circle. If we don't have the skills to be able to um, take advantage of these tools and generate personalized experiences, uh, then we probably need to upgrade our own digital skills before we're able to spread them out.
That's a good point. And you talked a little bit about this when we were prepping for this demo that, or for this webinar session, that even though this is a topic of interest for us and we work with technology every single day of our lives, that's what our company does. We're still learning too. We're always thinking about what we want to learn next and where we're going to go next, and how that can foster that kind of lifelong learning, but also help us to help educators and people who are in the learning and development space. Because one of the things we see is there's a lot of technology out there, and it can be very important in education. But I think that there's not always a lot of support for how to incorporate things like digital literacy into teacher education, but then into curriculum as well, so that we are developing and creating a sustainable roadmap for digital literacy development in our curriculum for our learners, for the people building out our training, for the people who have to use the technology. Um, do you have ideas of ways that you have you ever like incorporated digital literacy into any of the content you've built or the teaching or training that you've done in the past?
Well, the answer is yes. And yeah, and the experience that you mentioned, I think it really speaks
Mhm.
to it, because in my past life, I used to be a consultant for development of investment projects using like public funds for regional development. And we used to focus on a couple of areas. There were innovation, tourism, and education. And before I arrived into the company, the training was very about how to use the system that the government had made for you to submit your projects, your investment projects. And it was kind of like this window. In this window, you do this, and these buttons do this, and then you go to this other window, and then you export, and then kind of very based like on the transaction. What we realized is that there was a logic, and it's funny because the designers of the software had when they developed the software, it was based on the logical framework. I mean, it was built by developers, but also by project managers. And they use this methodology, which is very common in like public investment projects. So we just realized, why don't we teach people into those concepts? Because going back to the idea at the beginning, if you first know what you want to get out of it, how you want to get it done, and that methodology has something that I still use from time to time, which is called the problem tree. So if you're focusing on an issue, and you needed to kind of read up on the government plans and so on, because you needed your project, whatever it was, to be articulated to the global plan of the country. You had to focus on that problem and start to think of like ramifications and roots. Like what happens if this issue goes unaddressed? Then it has this consequence and so on. And what is the root cause of those issues? So, and the idea is that if you properly presented the situation by attacking the roots, you should see like kind of a casual effect of like up the line. And it was also really fun because the workshops that we arranged, they were not anymore about like a bunch of slides with a bunch of screenshots or things like that, but they began with an activity where everyone was trying to build their own trees, and you can kind of move problems and causes around and so on until they have a kind of this clarity of what the problem was. And based on that, it was just much easier to just swift through the issue, shift to the technology itself to make you do what you really wanted to do, which is not really learn how to create a project there, but how to successfully present a project that would then require approval by other entities, so your community could get funding for a problem that they were having. So I thought that was really interesting. And I think it's a good time for us to just mention that many of the topics that we touch here on digital literacy, we have a course for that in the academy. So yeah, this is just a sample of the offer that we have currently at the Academy. So you're free to check it out. I'm not sure if we have any content that's open and free.
We do have a couple things. So we have some resource courses that you can enroll in for free at Open LMS Academy. We have one that's built on using AI and Chat GPT as part of the teaching and learning cycle. And that one's been a pretty helpful resource course. We have a couple of others. We add new resource courses regularly. So you'll see one pop up too for the digital literacy piece here that will have some links and additional information that goes out to you. And Chris, one of the things you talked about when you were helping to promote digital literacy as part of a training curriculum that you were delivering was that you started with something that was kind of fun and engaging, but had people using some technology. And, that's the equivalent of an icebreaker, a way to get people in to make them feel like they have some power and autonomy over the technology. They can use it in a way that maybe they're familiar with, or it's very easy to quickly become familiar with what the activity is. And that's always a good launching point for helping to build digital literacy with people. I have been to many training classes, and I'm sure many of you have as well, where the course just launches immediately into a highly technical or very cognitively intense topic. And it makes it really hard for someone who has fewer skills in that area to engage with that content. So, having that kind of warm up where we let people engage with what we're trying to talk about, but in a way that's familiar to them, is a really nice way to bridge the gap between where people's digital literacy skills are at a baseline and where we need them to be. Because at a baseline, the digital literacy skills are often different for everyone we have enrolled. And I know that when it comes to education, this is something that comes up pretty regularly. Is that teachers often have the challenge of trying to figure out where people's digital literacy skills are and then bridge that gap so they can do whatever they need to do. We see this a lot with corporate training as well. As we work with clients, they'll often talk about some of the people who need to do this type of training or compliance training have very strong digital literacy skills, and others don't use technology. Their digital literacy is very low, but we need both groups of people to be able to get into this training, take it, and move on, regardless of where they're starting. And so, that kind of brings us to thinking about what skills make up digital literacy. And one of the first skills that makes up digital literacy is like navigating online information. And when we think about this, we know that we need to help individuals develop skills to critically evaluate online information for credibility and bias. That's true with the content that we might produce and put out, but overwhelmingly, we are asking people to learn from us and then engage with content in the real world. And part of being able to do that is developing skills to critically evaluate that online information. I think we've all been victim to seeing something online and then needing to follow through because it was kind of a sensationalized tagline, only to find out that wasn't true. Back in the day, Snopes was what we went to. We would go and say, is this true? And Snopes would help you. But even prior to that, I think that we had these information literacy considerations prior to the digital world, but the amount of information we had access to is much smaller. So I could always go back to this concept of like when you were growing up and someone told you something like you drove past a hay field and you saw the bales were round and wrapped in white plastic, and you might ask someone, "What is that?" And they tell you it's a marshmallow field. And you unfortunately grow into a teenager who says this and finds out that's not a marshmallow field. That was an example of information literacy. Someone told you something and maybe you didn't have the critical thinking skills to figure out that that was wrong. But the information we were exposed to at that point was very small and very contained, and it was very kind of specific and situational. But
Yeah,
today, yeah, go ahead, Chris.
no, I think that's a great point, because I think there's a lot of concern, and people are worried and kind of sometimes even scared about technology, about what's out there online on the internet. And I think, no, I mean, if you look back, if you take that perspective of really kind of going with whatever people told you and have no way to really check it out or what to do. And now we are at a place where, yes, there's a lot of people, and there's, to put it, I don't know if this is the best way to put it, but there's kind of a battle for your attention, for making you care about this thing, and there's like weaponization of information.
That's
Um,
exactly it. Mhm.
and that's true. And of course, and part of the goal of spaces like this, of promoting the importance of these literacy skills, is to say, hey, there are right ways to navigate this information, but the information is out there, and there are ways for you to find the right information and to discuss it with that. I want to bring up this comment by Trevor. Hey, Trevor. I think one of the C's that he mentioned is confidence. And I think that's really, really important. Like, and it's a question about how do you become confident of your own skills and that the information that you have is actually truthful. And I think you give part of the answer, or we've given parts of the answer. And I think it's knowing that you cannot do these things like solo, knowing that you have, not only you are able to contrast information, but you're also, you can rely on other people who you trust, or some sources that you believe or that you can rely on more than others. And over time, like, I'm very bullish on community initiatives and ways in which people together build knowledge, run projects, and do different kinds of things. And I think that's also a way to build confidence, because if we are in a group of people and some of them are really tech savvy and they know their stuff around the system and so on, they can share that. But the others who may not be tech savvy, they're probably experts in a specific domain, and they can bring that kind of knowledge. And I think now, talking about digital literacy, to me, it involves understanding psychology, sociology, like how people react, and like in general, how people behave online in community settings. So these different people adding what they know help all of us kind of build a much better picture, a much better understanding of any topic. Speaking of what you were mentioning about disinformation, it's very common now to, many colleges are trying to, well, kind of counter all this spread of misinformation. We know in the US it's kind of, we're in an election year there, so the amount of content like meant to weaponize or using AI to generate all kinds of different content is just going to explode. So I think this method, probably not the only one, but I think it's a very, very useful and very common one to kind of counterattack this. But I think it's important, again, to mention that this method is good as long as it's practiced within kind of a community setting, or probably like a project involving different students.
Yeah, the I there, the investigate. So increasing your awareness about topics and authors and the content, that really comes from the community piece, right? If I'm living in a silo or living in a vacuum where I am only exploring things from my specific awareness or my context or view, it makes it hard for me to really investigate what might be accurate or inaccurate information. And so taking that opportunity to increase your awareness in part by connecting with people kind of outside of your everyday or just connecting with other people in general is a super helpful and really critical step as part of the SIFT method to combat misinformation. So I think that, yeah, we keep kind of coming back to that community piece of how
Yeah.
information is truly a shared experience, isn't it? Where we um, have to connect with community of people to gather information, to share information, and this method absolutely helps us with that. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
I
go ahead.
if we go in order, I think like the first one I think is really important whenever you see something that's crazy or something that is what is this true or not, or even something that could kind of you cannot discount it as true because maybe you don't have well the time or something, but just the understanding that maybe something's happening. But it's important to recognize that well, you need to kind of take a pause. Wherever you find some piece of information that might be important or controversial to some extent. Going back to the idea of weaponized information means there's actors out there trying to make you believe certain things or want to do certain things. So it's really important that when you stop, you kind of ask yourself, what is this headline or what is this piece of content making me feel?
Mm,
And is this something intended by someone? And is it trying to get something specific out of me? And I think that's really important. And again, in a community setting, it's much easier to be able to recognize those emotions because you can see it in others and you can actually work them out in others. And then between people, like I just think of like a school project based on this method where we can pick like a topic, probably like a controversial or hot topic that's out there,
mhm.
and between the students or the peers ask themselves like, what do you think about this? But what, I think before asking what you think about it is, what's your first reaction when you read something like this? And
I
then,
That's a really great point. Is to rather than what do you think about it, or immediately trying to deploy critical thinking skills, recognizing how the information made you feel initially is a great way to dive into how would you unpack this information and find out more about it. So if I read something and it immediately made me feel scared, I might go and look for these like hysterical um types of claims about the same thing, right? Like, oh, this must be something to be afraid of. So our initial feelings about information directly impacts what we do next, how we choose to engage with that. Um, our initial feelings also play into our second digital literacy skill, which is about privacy and security. And again, you would use the SIFT. I use the SIFT method here as well. So when we talk about privacy and security, one of the key digital literacy skills is helping people to understand how to maintain their own privacy and how to keep their personally identifiable information secure. Um, there are many times, I'm sure if we did a show of hands, we would all raise our hands about a time someone we know fell victim to a robocall or a virus that popped up on their screen and said your computer's infected, you have to enter your credit card information to contact support or something, and people have done that. um, but it's that initial feeling of panic that makes people tend to volunteer that information. So if they just stop for a minute, they acknowledge what their initial feelings were, and then say, well, does that seem rational that I am this afraid and this happens? Why haven't I heard of this before? That will help them to better use the SIFT method to figure out if what's happening is real or if it's been sensationalized or just created to make people feel a very strong emotion. And so, digital literacy skills 1 and 2 really are part and parcel. They are things that kind of come together. Um, and I know that we've talked quite a bit about why it's so important for individuals to understand concepts like online privacy and cybersecurity, or even things like what your digital footprint is. So when we talk about digital footprint, one of the things that comes up is when people post pictures of other people online, that creates a digital footprint for that other person without their consent. So, thing to remember, if you are posting pictures of training or you are posting pictures of your children, you've now created a digital footprint for them, which kind of brings us into our next digital literacy skill, which is the AI piece, because AI can detect, there's a lot of facial recognition that relies on AI. So if I post a picture of my children and they have been pictured anywhere else in any context, conceivably AI can actually do a little facial recognition if it has access to those different pictures and piece together a digital persona for my kids or for whomever. Very much like if you Google your own name, you might find pictures and images of you didn't even realize were out on the internet. So, digital literacy skill number 3 is understanding AI, what it can do, what it can't do, how to use it safely, and how to recognize where you might want to be aware of what is happening with AI. Um, and I know you had some thoughts kind of on that as well, like the idea of effective and responsible use of AI. Are there other things that you think of when you think about AI as a digital literacy skill?
Yeah, I think, and again, the community principle still applies because as and funny, another thing that I wanted to acknowledge Michael for is because he kicked off this Slack channel with AI about resources, and he had a lot of things, and he had a lot of really interesting uh, tools. Like once he just put a video and he was speaking the most perfect Spanish, and it was completely AI. And it was really interesting. But I think without the proper context, people can be easily misled, I think, by these kinds of tools. Other people, they kind of want to be aware, but they may not see kind of the value of AI in their work, or they just don't want to concern themselves with it, which is completely respectable. But others that do, that are part of the same work or the same community or the same school, they can still kind of be on the lookout for things that may not look as good, and they may have a certain knowledge that others don't have, and kind of the success of this practice kind of depends of the ability of each person to be willing to share what they know. It's really funny to me that inside our company, like the central level from London, they do some phishing training. Not really, well, they do training, but they actually do some, how do you call it? Like experiments.
Yeah, like a
And
simulation.
yeah. So without anybody, I mean, obviously, like without most of the company knowing about it, they just send an email, like a phishing attempt. And it's something that may sound kind of realistic, like, oh, please update your password on the HR portal, whatever. But what I find so funny is that pretty much a couple of minutes after everyone gets the email, you start seeing like some chat by someone like, hey, don't click on this button, because it's phishing. It's not true. So be aware, okay? And some of them I just didn't realize, and when I look at, oh yeah, it's phishing, okay. And before I used to think, oh no, she ruined the experiment because she told us everyone not to click on it.
Mhm.
But now, come to think of it, no, she did perfectly fine because others. I mean, we are an IT company, so we expect that most of us have a general awareness. But I think it's good ultimately that we can rely on others who can provide the support, and of course we trust them. They're our colleagues. Um, so I think as long as most of us have these kind of different ways to face information and refer others, like some people can do the investigation for us, some people can find the reference for us, but I think that SIF process could be done not just by one person. Of course, you can do it by yourself if you're kind of researching, doing something, but I think it's much more satisfying and much more effective if it's done by several people.
I agree, and that was a good example of the phishing scenarios that we sometimes have, the simulations that come out for us that you know, you do wonder, did it ruin their plan? Did it ruin the plan if we do this? But actually, it doesn't, right? So, sharing out accurate information is really a crucial digital literacy skill, and that's what happens. Is someone will say, "Hey, did anyone else get this email?" So you have this community that you can check with. This is what I think it is, and someone might say, "Oh, I looked at this part of it. I looked at that part of it," and together we've constructed an idea of what's happening, and now we can do the trace back, and that all happens because we're communicating really well with one another. um, we have about 10 minutes left, and one of the last topics we kind of want to talk about is the digital divide. So we've got lots of great digital skills in here for people to develop. We've talked about the fact that people come into situations with varying degrees of digital literacy, but sometimes we don't talk about why there are various degrees of digital literacy. And so we've established that there's a misconception that that's age based. But let's say that you have 100 people in the 18 to 24 year old range. When you bring them together, there's still going to be a significant variation in the digital literacy skills in that group. And a big part of that is because of the digital divide. Despite the fact that we are, in a post-COVID world where lots of people had to go online and do everything online, if nothing else, what COVID taught us was that there are large parts of the world and even in the United States where people do not have access to broadband at home. And the graphic that Chris has up right now, the areas that are in red are places where there is not consistent broadband for everyone who lives in those areas. So now I live in upstate New York, which is in the upper on your screen, probably right hand side of the screen. And Chris and I were talking yesterday, and I was saying I have broadband access, I have cable internet access. I don't have access to DSL, I don't have access to fiber. But if you go 15 minutes from my house, there is no broadband in the towns that surround mine. People have to use satellite or they go without internet at home. They rely on cell service. Cell service covers more area than broadband does in a lot of places. And that's kind of like zeroing in on sort of like what things are like here. And you can see the red areas there, what we call upstate New York. Those are areas that are kind of in the mountains, but are lower population. But as we look at the US as a whole, there are large areas that do not have broadband access at home. So if all you had was a device that had no internet access, your digital literacy skills are probably smaller. Um, so, that is something to keep in mind. And Hart just posted that thanks to the infrastructure bill that was recently passed in our country, Spectrum has just buried cable right on her property. And Hart lives in a somewhat rural area as well. I know. I love when I get to have chats with her and she shows me her view from where she is. And we often connect with different people in the Western US who there's only high-speed internet on a campus or at work. And it's important to know that when we talk about the digital divide, not everyone has access. So as we look at the world and its gaps by region, by income, by age, and by gender, it helps to explain why people come to us with varying digital literacy skills, but also the amount of time it might take for them to develop digital literacy skills, because not everyone has the opportunity to leave the work or school environment, go home and practice those skills if they don't have access to the internet. Certainly, you can develop some. You can work on a computer that's offline or use your phone when it's offline or something like that. But being able to go out and really investigate information or connect with community from a digital perspective really does rely on access to broadband internet. And we were going to talk about some of the initiatives or policies in place to improve digital access in underserved communities. But you already saw that Hart commented that we in the US, there have been several infrastructure bills in different states and at the federal level to try to bring broadband to different places. I lived in Vermont at one time, and it was on the very early side of broadband at home, moving away from like dial up internet. And there was a bill within the state that helped to bring internet to rural communities in Vermont. And so for Hart, if we go all the way out there to the west coast, and there she is, and it's south western Oregon, So south and west, so she's kind of close to the coast. You can see that along that area, you do have right along that California border, you've got areas that don't have broadband access. And you would think that being that that is the west coast of the US, highly populated as you're closer to the water, but you still have a lot of areas that don't have broadband access there. This is true globally. So globally, we know that there are many underserved communities who do not have um, access to different to broadband, to internet at all. Um, and there are some different stats coming into the chat right now where you can look at internet broadband stats by gender, income, and more, and other characteristics to have a
Yeah.
really good understanding of why we have such a digital divide.
Right. I mean, despite what it looks like here, the US is one of the better connected countries out there. I didn't find like the latest statistics, but I think it's around 60% of people who have access to any form of internet connection, be it broadband, mobile, satellite, and so on. Of course, the geography affects a lot, but if we talk about the US, which at the top has about 86% of internet penetration, that still leaves around 35 million people or so without like stable connectivity, which I think is kind of a big deal. But as Harp mentioned, there's been like initiatives, the infrastructure bill. There's also like Starlink and satellite options, and both are kind of subject to debates. Of course, it's good that there's an infrastructure for a country, but if for every reason comes a new president who doesn't really care about it, then who knows what's going to happen there. And then I just wanted to mention once again the power of community, because I know of a lot of initiatives of rural broadband where communities organize together and they find a way to provide themselves with broadband, often at much lower prices that are available by the few like nationwide players and so on. And I also wanted to mention, just to wrap things up, there's lots of initiatives here and you can check them out. I'll put the links here. Here in Colombia, we're having a kind of a debate for the new digital transformation plan. And I find it interesting that they mentioned not just connecting areas, and there's areas where we have absolutely no kind of internet. But now they're thinking, of course, we are going to connect with roads, and then on the road, next to the road, we can put up the wires and connect the broadband. But the effort cannot stop there. And then we go back to the digital literacy skills, because what they need to do is that we need to equip them with the tools for them to have a more productive and fruitful use of these technologies. Otherwise, if we just plug everyone to the internet, they're just going to end up browsing social media like all day long.
Yes, and we see a lot of that. All right, everyone. Well, we are just about at time. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. Remember, stop by the Open LMS Academy, where we will have a free resource course that has some of these links in it, as well as some of the different statistics and articles that we've shared today. So be on the lookout for that. Join us next month for our EdTech Chat, where we are going to talk about the future of AI. Little recap of where we've been with AI, what the situation was about a year ago, and where we think the future of AI could take us. So join us next month for that one. Thanks everyone for being here. And I will hopefully see you all next month. Bye, everyone.
Bye, and happy Digital Education Day.